Today, we're going to be talking about creating a habitat garden for native bees. And we are going to start off the presentation by discussing some of the native bees and how to identify them and tell them apart. And then we'll move into how to benefit them in your own garden and landscape. So the first thing that we need to talk about is the difference between wasps and bees. And these are both in the order Hymenoptera, which means that they have certain characteristics that kind of group them together. And they are, as we look closely at them, both going to have a constriction between the thorax and the abdomen. And usually we call this a pinched waist or a wasp waist, but both of them have it. So our wasps are going to be the information that you see on the left-hand side of the slide. Our bees are going to be on the right-hand side of the slide. So on the left-hand side, that is a southern yellow jacket that you see in the image there. And for wasps in general, they tend to be more elongated in their body shape than bees are. They tend to have longer legs, but unless you are comparing them side by side, that can be a very difficult thing to discern. And with them, they are going to have either few to no hairs on their body. And when they do have hairs on their body, it's usually not a lot of hairs. The wasps are going to feed on nectar as adults, and they are also, as adults, going to go out and hunt for insects and spiders. And they will sting those, paralyze them, bring those back to their nest or nursery area, depending on if they're solitary or social. And they will either feed those in the case of the social wasps, like paper wasps or yellow jackets. They will feed those to their offspring. But in the case of solitary wasps, such as cicada killers or mud daubers, those are going to provision a nursery area, and they're going to create that nursery area. They're going to cram it full of the paralyzed insects or spiders, and then they're going to lay an egg on that and seal that up, and then they'll move on to the next location to do the same thing. So essentially, when that egg hatches out in that nursery area, they're going to have that food provided for them, and they will feed on that and develop and eventually emerge out as an adult, usually the following year. When we look at our bee, which is on the right-hand side of the slide here, they tend to have a more compact body, not always, but often, and they are typically going to have hairs on their body. Some bees are hairier than others. If you think about a bumblebee, usually very, very hairy. We kind of think of those as like the teddy bears of the bee world, or at least I do. And so those hairs are often there because they are going to use that a lot of times to pick up pollen that they can then collect. And some bees will have hairs on their underside of their abdomen that they'll actually use to carry the pollen. So these are going to gather pollen and nectar as food for their offspring, and they will take that back to their nursery area, or again, nest or colony, depending on what bees we're talking about. And then they will have that food there for the young when they emerge out of the egg. Some bees are going to, or at least those that have less hairs on their body, they may have a specialized area in their digestive tract called a crop that they will use to store pollen or nectar, and they'll use that when they get back to the nest or nursery to regurgitate, and then they have that area or that substance to provide for their offspring. So the majority of the bees that we are talking about today are going to be solitary. And overall, when we look at bee populations, 90% of bees are solitary, which that means that they essentially live alone and they forage alone and they just kind of mind their own business. So it's not really one of those things that you have to worry about them kind of attacking you. Usually when that happens, that's because you are kind of up in the nest area of something. If you think about honeybees, if you approach where a beehive is, then that is their home. That is where they have their young. That is where they have their food stores. So if you would relate this to you as a human, if somebody breaks into your house or, starts hovering around and looking all suspicious around your house, you're going to want to defend that, especially if you have children in there. So it's kind of the same thing. They're going to come out and defend. But with solitary bees, they are very different from honeybees. And with a solitary bee, they essentially are provisioning not a nest area, but a nursery area, because that is where the next generation of bees is developing, and then they're going to emerge the following year. So that could be a stem, that could be a cavity, that could be in the ground. A lot of them will live in the ground, and they are going to be solitary, but they will often aggregate. And that's essentially, you can equate that to kind of like a human neighborhood. You find a good neighborhood and you want to move into that neighborhood because it's a good neighborhood. So same thing with bees. They find a good area, and so more bees are going to be in that area, but that doesn't mean that they are social. So solitary bees are typically going to be non-aggressive because they're not storing food. They're not protecting their offspring. They're just kind of, making a space, provisioning that nest, laying eggs, and then moving on to the next thing. They're going to gather that nectar and pollen for the offspring, but once they have provided that and they lay that egg on it, they're off to the next location. So they are not hanging around that particular area waiting to make sure that everything's okay. They're finding another place to create the next nursery area. So our first solitary bees that we are going to talk about are the mining bees. These are in the family Andrenidae, and this is the largest bee family. And these bees can be anywhere from tiny to large in size. They have a medium body, and you're going to see this on my slides, whether it has a small, medium, or large body. And that's essentially, with a small body, they're kind of like skinny and thin, whereas a medium body is just that. And then when we're talking about a large body, that's going to be more of a stout structure. If you think about a carpenter bee or a bumblebee, those are going to be ones that have large bodies. They're kind of big and bulky. But these, for the mining bees, they are going to have a medium body shape, typically going to be dark in color, usually dark brown to black. And they often are going to have a striped abdomen. And if you look closely in the picture on the upper left-hand corner, that stripe is usually going to be hairs that you're seeing on their body. And when you look at keys, a dichotomous key, if you're identifying these, they are going to have two grooves below their antennal sockets. So where the antennae attach to the head capsule, there's going to be two grooves sitting below that, and that will differentiate them from a bee group that we're going to talk about in a few minutes. And these are going to be a short-tongued bee. You can see that in the right-hand side picture. You can see that the mouth parts aren't really, really long, so they are a short-tongued bee. These are going to be ground nesters, and hence, mining bees, they're mining in the ground. And these, I love these. So they will dig their nest straight down into the ground, and they are solitary, but they can aggregate. And these are one of our bee families that have a waterproof substance that is excreted by the female bees, and they'll actually line those little tunnels or nursery nest areas with that waterproof substance. So if it gets rain or anything and there's that rainfall, their offspring and their provisions are protected in that little nest area because they have that waterproof substance that is protecting it, which I think is so incredibly cool. The plasterer bees, these are going to be in the family Coletidae. And again, these are going to be a medium-bodied bee. They are anywhere from small to large in size. And these are usually a brownish gray color. A lot of them are going to have a pointy abdomen. You can see that at the bottom picture there, how that abdomen kind of comes to a point. And they are typically going to have pale yellow to whitish stripes on that abdomen. This is another short-tongued bee. You can see that really distinctly in the upper picture there. The tongue is often very broad, and the end of the tongue, if you look at it underneath magnification, it is actually split, kind of like a snake's tongue. And this is the one that I was mentioning just a minute ago. So if you remember, the Andrenidae or the mining bees are going to have 2 sutures below their antennal sockets. And our plasterer bees in the family Coletidae are going to have 1 suture below their antennal socket. But unless you're looking at them with a good hand lens or microscope, you're not going to be able to see that. These are another ground nesting bee. They also can be cavity nesters a lot of times in pithy stemmed plants or plants that have hollow stems in them. These are able to aggregate. So again, they find a good nest site. More than one bee may use that area. And these are another one that will secrete that waterproof substance to line their nest for protection from wet areas. Sweat bees are probably some of my favorite bees. These are in the family Halictidae. And I remember as a kid, I grew up in the country, and you would go out of the house in the morning and you would come back in the evening and you're just running around crazy, or at least I was running around crazy the whole time. And in the summertime, you sweat. And the sweat bees would come in and they would land on you. And as long as you like leave them alone and don't panic and don't smash them or anything, they will actually just kind of hang out on your skin, and they will use their tongue to get the sweat off of your skin. And essentially they're getting salts and minerals from that sweat off of your skin. And I went to Ohio to visit my parents this past summer. And when I was outside working, I had sweat bees and I was just like, oh, look, I felt like a kid again. I was giddy. So these bees are going to be tiny to medium size. So these ones are often overlooked in the garden. These are one of our slendered body bees, and they are often a dark color. Sometimes you're going to see them in greens or possibly like green, blue, teal kind of colors, metallic, absolutely beautiful. And some of them are going to have abdominal stripes. So you see on the upper picture there, that one is a dark brownish black color, but it does have those pale stripes on the abdomen. These are going to have hair on their hind legs that they will use to carry pollen. They are another short-tongued bee. And this one, if you look at the middle picture there, that arrow is pointing to the basal vein on the wing. That is one of the characteristics that we look at in a dichotomous key. So we look for 1 antennal suture, again, just like the Coletids, but this one has an arcuate basal vein on the wing. So essentially that just means that vein that you're looking at there in the wing that the arrow is pointing to, it is in a arc form. This is another usually ground nesting bee, but some of them will nest as well in rotting wood. So if you want to kind of create a habitat for them, I'm going to talk about putting a log in your landscape later on so you can do something like that. And these range, so they can be anything from solitary to communal, which means that they're kind of aggregating, but then there are some that are also going to be semi-social, which means that they'll have some cooperation. Excuse me. Mason bees are probably the most famous of our solitary bees. These are actually going to be utilized as pollinators in some areas of the United States. These are also known as orchard bees, and they are in the family Megachilidae. And typically the genera that we're looking at is going to be the Osmia. These are a small to medium-sized bee. They do have a very stout body. So this is kind of one of the big body bees, even though they are a small bee. They are black to blue-black to metallic blue to metallic green. They are going to have very hairy bodies usually, and this is one of the bees that they're going to carry that pollen on hairs that are found on the underside of the abdomen. And then for those of you that are using a dichotomous key for bee identification, we're going to look at the claws, the tarsal claws at the tip of the front legs. And we're going to look for a flat pad-like structure between those tarsal claws, and that is the orolium. These are going to be gregarious, or they aggregate, and these are cavity nesters. So when we're talking about putting up a quote unquote bee house, which is technically a bee nursery, this is going to be one of the bees that you are hoping to attract in. And so they are cavity nesters, and you will see that they will line and seal those cavities with mud, hence the mason bee name. Leafcutter bees. These are also in the family Megachilidae, but these are in the genera Megachile. And this is another medium-sized bee that has a stout body. And for these ones, when I look at leafcutter bees, it looks like somebody smushed their abdomen. So they have a very flat abdomen, and if you look at the picture on the top left and then the bottom right, you can see what I mean with that flattened abdomen. But you can see on the upper right why they have that flattened abdomen. So that one is actually carrying the pollen on the underside of the abdomen. And so you can see that's kind of rounding out the abdomen and balancing out that insect. So these are going to be a dark brown to black color. They do have stripes on their abdomen, and usually they have lots of hairs on their thorax and heads as well. If you look in between the tarsal claws on their front legs, they are going to have spines instead of that flat pad like the mason bees do. And these are another cavity nester, but these are going to line their nest or cavity spaces with leaves and other vegetation. And you can have these in the same area as you will have mason bees. So you can see in that middle picture there, we have some mason bees in there that have blocked off that tube with mud, but then we also have that leafcutter bee going in there and using those empty cavities. So you are able to have them kind of sharing that space. Large carpenter bees are in the family Apidae. The genus for here is Xylocopa. These are some of our very large bees. A lot of people will mistake these for bumblebees. But With carpenter bees, we say, or at least I say, that they have a shiny hiney. So if you look at the abdomen on a carpenter bee, it is going to be either a shiny black color or a shiny blue-black color. So usually on the thorax, it's going to be very hairy. It may be more yellow, it may be black. So hairy thorax, kind of smooth on the abdomen, and it's going to be shiny. These are going to have bristles on their back legs that they will use to collect and carry the pollen. And these are going to be cavity nesters. They will create their cavity in the wood. So typically when we're talking about mason bees and leafcutter bees, they are seeking out cavities that already exist. With carpenter bees, they find softwood and they are going to chew a round hole into that space. And so that kind of goes in, and then they kind of go at a right angle to that once they get so deep into the wood. And then that's what they're going to start provisioning, then laying the egg off. So these are going to be solitary. These can be damaging if they are creating that nursery space in wood that you don't want them to. Usually this is more of a problem in other parts of the United States than Texas. But if you don't want carpenter bees getting into something, you can either use polyurethane or paint on the wood, and they won't bore into that. So if you have untreated wood that's like soft or kind of rotting, then they can probably attack that. We also have small carpenter bees, also in the family Apidae, and these are going to be in the genus Ceratina. These are very small. They have slender bodies, and they are going to be a shiny black color, but a lot of them are going to have yellow face markings, like you see in the right-hand picture there. These are typically going to be hairless, or they're not very hairy. They do have some like very fine hairs in their body, but not a lot. And they typically will have hairs on their hind legs that they're going to use to store and carry that pollen back to their nest or nursery areas. This one is another cavity nester. They're going to seek out cavities, and these can be anywhere from solitary to semi-social. Chimney bees. This is another Apidae family, or Apidae, yeah, family. And this is going to be in the gene or tribe Amphorini. So this is a larger group. So tribe is kind of above genus. These are a larger bee. They have a stout body and very, very hairy bodies. So hairs on the head, thorax, and abdomen. Usually legs are very hairy as well. They are usually going to have short antennae, and then they're going to have pale bands on that abdomen. So you can see that on that bottom picture there. If you look closely at them underneath magnification or a microscope, you will see ocelli in between their compound eyes above the antennae. If we look at the picture here on the upper right-hand side, the compound eyes are the main eyes that the bee sees with. And these three little dots that you see up here on the top of the head, those are the ocelli. And that's essentially how some insects can detect light level changes. So these are going to have a head that is more narrow than their thorax. And then on the hind legs, they are going to have that stiff brush of hairs to carry the pollen. These are a ground nesting bee. You can see that on the upper left-hand picture. And they are called chimney bees because these are going to build turrets over their nest entrance. And so it looks like little tiny chimneys. So these ones can be solitary to communal, so they will aggregate in areas that have good soil for them to build that particular nest structure. Longhorn bees are another one in the Apidae family. This is in a different tribe. This is Eucerini. These are a medium-sized bee with a medium-sized body. They are hairy, but these are typically going to be dark in color a lot of times. There are some of them that are more of a grayish color, but you can see in the upper picture there that there are some that are black that have yellow, and they don't necessarily always have striping. The males of here are going to have very long antennae. And the wing cells, again, you need a microscope or a good hand lens. They're actually going to have tiny hairs in the cells of their wings. They're going to have a protruding clypeus. That's what you see in the bottom picture there. The clypeus is a structure on the head, usually between the eyes above the mouth parts. So these are going to be ground nesting bees, and they will often aggregate. Oh, and they carry, I'm sorry, they carry the pollen on their hind legs. Squash bees are going to be a type of longhorn bee. So they're in the family Apidae, still in the tribe Eucerini. And these ones are going to be in the genera Peponapsis and Xenoglossa. So these are going to be pretty specific as to what they collect their pollen from. You can probably guess from their name that that's going to be squash, gourds, pumpkins, anything that is going to be in that cucurbit group. And these are usually going to be very active early in the day when those flowers first open up. And they'll go down in there and they're kind of just hanging out and doing their thing. And they might actually, get trapped in there. But if they do get trapped in there, it's really not a problem. They do have mandibles. Bees are going to have mandibles as well as that tongue. So they can actually chew their way out of that flower if they do get trapped in there. So if you look at the bottom picture there, you see the two bees up on the petals, but if you look at that dark space down in the flower, those are actually a whole bunch of other bees that are kind of down in there rolling around and kind of doing their thing. So the Peponapsis are going to have strong hair bands on top of the abdomen. So you can see that on the upper picture there. Excuse me. And then the Xenoglossa are going to often have yellow or ivory markings on their face or mandibles. So again, you're either going to need to get a really good picture of them, of the face, if you want to identify those particular bees. Our digger bees, this is another one in the family Apidae, and this is in the genus Anthophora. These are going to be medium-sized bees. They have stout bodies, so they're kind of big and bulky, and they're going to be very, very hairy. These are going to have a very wide head. It's as wide as the thorax, as you can see in both of those pictures there. Some of them are going to have stripes on their abdomen, and some of them have very faint stripes on their abdomen, as you can see in the one in the bottom picture there. These are going to have hairs on their hind legs that they are going to utilize to carry that pollen. And these are going to be ground nesting bees. The oil digger bees, these are also called desert bees or pallid bees. These are another one in the family Apidae. This is in the genus Centris. And these are some of our larger bees. They are going to have a stout body, and they can sometimes be mistaken for bumblebees if you don't know what you're looking at. So these are going to be usually a dark brown to black color, and black usually on the abdomen, and then the thorax is going to be either like a yellow to maybe sometimes a tan color. Males are going to have very large eyes, and usually the eyes are very colorful. So you can see instead of black eyes, those ones have kind of a yellowish green eye. And these have very, very hairy or bushy hind legs that they use for collecting and carrying pollen. And these are called oil digger bees because they often will collect floral oils from the flowers that they visit. And these are going to be another ground nesting bee. All right, so those are all of the solitary bees that we're talking about. Now we're moving into the social bee. So this is going to be the bumblebees in the family Apidae. These are going to be in the genus Bombus. And these are, I think, everybody knows what bumblebees look like, or at least I hope everybody knows what bumblebees look like. But these are going to be medium to large sized, very, very hairy. They don't have a jugal lobe on their hind wing, which will differentiate them from honeybees, but I think it's very hard to mistake bumblebees and honeybees. But I also am an entomologist, so maybe not everybody understands that. And these are truly social insects or eusocial. So they have a queen bee and workers. And there's cooperative care of the young, and they will store nectar in their nests. They don't turn it into honey, but they do have little containers that they create that they will store that nectar in. They do not store nectar to survive over the winter. So essentially what happens in the fall of the year is that they will have a queen, they produce males, they emerge. Those queens are going to mate, and then that mated queen is going to overwinter in a protected space, and then she'll start a new colony the following year. So this just tells you what the jugal lobe is. It essentially looks like this little thumb-like structure that comes off of the hind wing. The honeybees are going to have a jugal lobe. The bumblebees do not. But if you mistake a honeybee and a bumblebee, I would say that you need maybe a good identification book or something. So we do have 9 species of bumblebees in Texas, and this particular section, this is from Texas Parks and Wildlife, and you can actually find this on their website. If you Google Texas bumblebees and Texas Parks and Wildlife, you will be able to pull this up. So when you're looking at identifying bumblebees, the first thing that you're going to look at is the thorax and the coloration on that thorax. So if you have a completely yellow thorax or almost completely yellow thorax, then you're going to split it out into these. So then you start looking at the abdomen section. So you can see the left hand be there, completely yellow thorax. So if you see that, then you go down and you look at the markings on the abdomen, and you're either going to get a brown belted bumblebee, a two-spotted bumblebee, or a common eastern bumblebee. If you have a mostly yellow thorax with just some black on the edges, then you're going to usually have an all black abdomen, and that is going to be the variable cuckoo bumblebee. If the thorax is going to have that broad black band in the middle of it, so yellow at the top and bottom, black in the middle, then you can have these. So you can see our black and gold bumblebee is going to have kind of a yellow stripe in the middle of the abdomen. Our golden northern bumblebee is going to only have black at the tip of the abdomen. Our southern plains bumblebee has mostly black on the abdomen and yellow at the top. And then our Sonoran has a little bit of black, then a yellow band, and then a black band. So it can be confusing if you are looking at a Sonoran or a black and gold bumblebee sometimes, because they look very, very similar. But, again, if you get a good picture or you actually are taking samples, you should be able to tell them apart. And then the other one that we have is going to be our half and half thorax. So the top half of the thorax is going to be yellow. The bottom half of the thorax is going to be black. And then that is going to be our American bumblebee. So when we look at a bumblebee nest, these are typically going to be underground. They really like using old rodent burrows. So, and that's something that if you set up artificial nests a lot of times, they will try to encourage you to purchase or, include like the smell of rodents, so you can put that in with the nest. Another option, if you're creating something and you want to attract bumblebees, you can go to like a local pet store and see if they have nest material from any of their rodents, so you can put that smell in there, and that might help attract bumblebees. So these are relatively small colonies, anywhere from 50 to 500 bees. And like I mentioned previously, these colonies tend to die off in late fall. Those mated queens are going to overwinter. And then you can see those little areas where they have their nectar stored. And you can also see the difference between the queen, which is the great big giant fat one there in the middle, and then our other ones that are the workers, which, you think about the size of a bumblebee, and that's a very large bee, but you can obviously see the queen is much larger than that. So she's like the giant, massive teddy bear. All right, so what can you do in your garden or landscape to help bees? And this is, I do want to preface this by saying it's not only going to help the native bees. If you start doing some of these, you're going to help just, insects overall, which in my opinion is a good thing, because we don't just have our pollinators, we also have our predators that we want to encourage and our decomposers. And so we're looking to provide that habitat and kind of a more balanced ecosystem. So the first thing is providing food. So we talked about how these are collecting pollen and nectar. So having host plants that are going to provide that pollen and nectar throughout their season is going to be very important. And that season is going to be spring through fall. So we talked about how these aren't typically going to be active in the winter time. And so we really don't have to be too terribly concerned about having things that are providing nectar and pollen in the winter. We want spring through fall providing that nectar. So plan your plantings so you have a succession of flowering plants, making sure that you have that early stuff, you have that stuff in the heat of the summer, which can be kind of tough here in Texas, and then you have those fall bloomers as well. Try to plant clumps of the same plant. That way you can have the maximum impact for attracting those insects in. That can give off a greater scent, that can pull them in, and then it's easier for them to find. Include a variety of colors of your flowers, as well as differing flower shapes, because different flower shapes will be more accessible for certain types of insects than others. And then, of course, making sure that your plants are going to be insecticide free is going to be very important. So making sure that you're not spraying those plants with pesticide or using systemic pesticides that can get into the pollen and nectar is going to be very important. So these are just some of the host plants that you can plant. This kind of shows you different flower shapes, different colors, and it can be very important to making sure that you have a variety of these. Shelter is another one, especially when we start moving into cooler times of the year, making sure that we have shelter. But shelter is also going to be important year round. So not just during the winter, but think about, if we have thunderstorms, where are they going to go for shelter? So making sure that you're planting in layers and plan for the mature height or fullness of the plant, and having ground covers and grasses and shrubs and trees and all those different layers. So you're providing that kind of layered thing for windbreaks and protection from rain and stuff like that is going to be very important. Leaving a little mess is something that I excel at in my landscape. So twig bundles, leaving the leaves on the ground. When those leaves fall off of the trees, whether that's in the fall or in the spring, depending on what kind of trees you have, you know, don't necessarily get rid of those. I usually rake mine into the flower beds, and that's just a layer of mulch that I allow to break down. Making sure that you have rocks in sunny areas for basking areas so they can warm up on those cooler mornings. And then having areas of bare soil. How many of the bees that we were talking about today am I saying these nest in the ground? If they are nesting in the ground and everything is covered by mulch or grass or plants, they're not going to have any place to go to. So having bare soil areas that they can utilize for those nursery areas is going to be very important. You can also provide them with artificial habitats. And if you do that, you want to make sure that they're in sheltered locations, that they are in a stable area, that they're not kind of waving around in the wind, and that they're east to southeast facing. You want them to get morning sun. So this is just kind of showing you the different layers that you have here. You have lower plants, those medium, and then the tall. This is kind of beautiful when you think about it. Various colors, various flowers, there's grasses. Yeah, it's a good kind of layout for what we're talking about when we're providing shelter, different types of colors, and a variety of plants for these insects. So when we're looking at both natural and artificial habitats, you can use a variety of materials. So of course, bare patches of ground. Yeah, if we have, we've been in a drought for a past couple years during the summer, and I've had turf die off, and I have essentially just left those areas. So I have bare patches of ground. I'm not worried about filling that in with anything. Those are areas that those bees can utilize to create their nursery or nest sites. You can create spaces or cavities with bricks, or you can use brush piles. The brush pile was an experiment that I did in my backyard for a while. I was hoping to get bumblebees to move in there because a lot of times they'll move into snags like that. Didn't get bumblebees. I did get rats, so the brush pile then had to be removed. So just be aware and kind of pay attention to what's going on in your yard if you're trying some of these things out. And then when we're looking at our artificial nest or nursery areas, some are going to be better than others, depending on what you want. If you just want bees, then use any depth that you want. But the nest block that you see on the bottom left-hand side, that is untreated wood, is a 4 by 4 inch piece of wood that they drilled holes in. And you can do something like that. It's very simple to do, but that depth of 4 inches isn't going to be deep enough for the females to be produced. So the female eggs or the fertilized eggs are going to be typically laid towards the back. And so you want greater than 6 inches, usually between 6 to 8 inches of a depth for the cavity space for those females to actually be in that cavity. But if you don't care and if you want males, then you can do that. The other thing is you do need to make sure this is placed in a stable location and that it does get morning sun. So this is something with the plants. If you have them in your yard, a lot of people see this and they freak out because there's plant damage. This is evidence of leafcutter bees. So they're going to cut those little semicircular portions out of plants. And that is going to be what they use to line those nursery areas. And so they're utilizing that to create the next generation. So if you see this in your landscape, you should be really, really happy because you're obviously doing something right and you have leafcutter bees nearby. So bee boxes here, if we're doing this, or if you do decide to do your bee boxes or bee nurseries, to be more accurate, you need to make sure that you are managing them properly. So this isn't just something that you can set out and leave and not ever deal with again. So with the holes, that one says 3 to 5 inches. I would really recommend at least 6 inches in length. The holes can be different sizes depending on what kind of cavity nesting bees you want, anywhere from 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch in diameter. You can use bamboo pieces, but if you are, you need to make sure that the constriction is deep enough that you're going to get that depth that you need. A lot of people can use rolled up newspaper as well if you want to recycle that, or you can use paper of some sort, wrap it around a dowel, and put that into a container. You can also buy cardboard tubes or things like that. That's what you see here in the crotch of the tree there. That is just a plastic tube. So you can actually create one with like a section of PVC pipe that has a cap on the end and then put those cardboard tubes in it. I find that those, in my opinion, are easier to utilize than these wood block houses, because what you need to make sure that you're doing is that you are cleaning those bee boxes after they emerge out. So once they've emerged out the following year, you need to take that section and clean it so you don't have a fungal or parasite load building up in that area. If you're using something with cardboard tubes, you can just pop that tube out and put a new one in, and you don't have to worry about cleaning anything, and you can recycle the cardboard. So this is a little bit different than the bee nursery. So the bee nursery or the bee boxes are going to be raising the next generation of bees. This is something that can just provide sheltered areas for overwintering bees or other insects. And this is just one of those very large kind of industrial sized cans that you can get. You can use any container. And then just again, found materials, sticks, pine cones, pine needles, toilet paper tubes, bamboo. Just cram that stuff in there and you can put it on the ground, you can put it in a tree, again, various habitats, and that's just going to provide an area of shelter. Can I track if something goes in there? I guess if I put a camera or something on it, I could, but I don't, because if something uses it, great. If not, it's really no skin off my back. So it really doesn't matter if they're using it or not. So some other ideas for overwintering locations. Like I mentioned earlier, leaving those leaves that fall off the tree can be a great way to provide overwintering or sheltering locations, not just for bees, but also other insects, as well as reptiles and other organisms. If you have plants that die back, like you see in the upper left-hand corner there, you can leave those until the following year to allow anything that is a cavity nester in that to emerge out. So typically I will leave those until the following spring, usually cut them back in late March, early April typically. And then we mentioned earlier about how some of the sweat bees will nest in rotting wood. You can create a possible habitat for them, and this could also work for carpenter bees as well. Take a large log, and do this away from your house. So, because this can get termites. So, take a large log, partially bury it into the ground, and then you just kind of let it do its thing. So, it's going to decompose and it's going to become a whole little ecosystem within itself. And so I did this a couple years ago. Last time I checked, I have termites in it. There's millipedes, there's all sorts of stuff, but you can get stuff in the log once it reaches a certain point, under the bark and underneath the log itself. So again, whole little ecosystem, very fascinating to watch over time. So this is a huge one in the summertime in Texas, is providing safe water sources for our insects. And these can be water dishes, mud baths, drippers, plants themselves if they're collecting water in the leaves or whatever. So who and what it's for is going to determine what you want to supply. So you might want to do a variety of these. So if you look on the left-hand side there, that's kind of the quintessential bird bath, right? That isn't really an ideal water source for our insects because there's nothing in that bird bath that they can land on and access that water safely. The pond on the right-hand side is a good way for them to actually get water because there is vegetation in that pond that they can crawl down and access that water. So when you're dealing with water for insects, it's essentially just making it so they can get into that water and access it without having them drown in it. So putting something into that water, that could be a large rock, that could be decorative glass beads, that could be pebbles, it could be sand, and it could be essentially any type of a container that you use. So, find something in your house or go to a thrift store. It doesn't have to be something fancy. On the bottom right, that is something that I made out of a old soaker hose and some zip ties. I just kind of spiraled it up and I ended up making a planter. So when I turned on the soaker hose, it watered the plants that were inside of it, but then it also allowed those insects to access those little beads of water that we're collecting on the soaker hose itself. Some other ideas, um, making sure that you have water that collects off of the downspout area. You can slow that water down. There's a dripper that is on the upper left-hand side that was made with some Quikrete in a 5-gallon bucket, and they just put the little dripper part in there. And then hummingbird feeders can also be used for our insects. A lot of times people will go out to their hummingbird feeders and they get annoyed because there's bees or wasps or ants that are at the hummingbird feeder and they're upset because like, this is for my hummingbirds. Well, those insects are also going to need those sugar sources as well. And you don't have to police the hummingbird feeder. They're going to sort it out on their own. So just let whatever animal is using that as a resource to do so. So other possibilities that you can do, on the right-hand side, you can provide them with sugar sources in addition to things like the hummingbird feeder, putting out melon scraps. So usually when I get melons, I cut off part of the rind and I'll put it into a suet basket and hang that outside. Usually you'll get, maybe butterflies, flies, bees, wasps. So this ensures that it's not going to be carried away by squirrels because it's in that suet basket and contained. You also can provide basking areas. This needs to be in an open, sunny area that is sheltered by wind. So you can see that middle picture there where you have that basking rock that's in the sun, but it's also protected by wind because it has plantings around it. You could also use logs that can double up as, that kind of ecosystem decomposing as well as a basking area, depending on the placement. So when you're thinking about providing sources for insects, really kind of get in there and think like a bug. What are they going to need to survive? And typically that is food, water, and shelter. So how can you provide that? How can you make that in your yard so they are welcome to be in there? So make sure that you have a variety of colors, flower shapes, and bloom periods throughout the season. And this is most importantly, let nature be nature. A lot of times I think we try to manage things, and when we start getting more and more hands-on, we disrupt things and kind of throw things off. And a lot of times in my yard, well, most of the time in my yard, I do absolutely nothing. A lot of people are like, well, what do you do to control blah, blah, blah? Usually nothing. I do control fire ants in my yard because I am allergic to them. So that is something that I need to do. But if I get like a heavy infestation of, I don't know, aphids or something on a plant, I use a water spray to knock them off the plant because that's going to help conserve those beneficials. And I don't need zero aphids. I still want aphids so I have those predators to have food, but I'm reducing that population so then those predators can come in and pick up the slack. Or if a lot of times I get stink bugs on my blackberries in the backyard. Get a handheld vacuum, remove them. That's again, I'm not looking for zero stink bugs. I'm looking for less of them. So that vacuum is going to help remove them very quickly, and I'm not using pesticides. So try to utilize ways that are going to be beneficial overall and really promote not only our pollinators, but also our predators and our decomposers. So as far as resources, the book that you see on the slide there, The Bees in Your Backyard, this, in my opinion, is by far the best book if you want information on native bees. It does have a very short blurb about honeybees in there, but honeybees aren't native. So while they're in there and mentioned in passing, this really focuses on native bees. And, it talks about their biology and what they eat and how to identify them. It's really just a fabulous book. And then on the right-hand side there, we have two websites. There's Wild Bees Texas, and then the other one is at the University of Texas. That is the Jaw Lab, and she works on native bees, has a wonderful lab, wonderful resources there. So as far as my contact information, if you want to contact me, it's really best to do so via email. I do tend to check that more regularly than my voicemail. And then I am on social media. If you follow social media, you can follow either Facebook, Instagram, or YouTube. I post the same thing to all three formats. It's just there are different audiences on those things. And so that's why I have three of them. But I do typically what I'm posting is going to be short video clips of insects that I find usually in my backyard, but also kind of other locations that I am. And it might be information on how to identify something or how to manage something or, just whatever I want to talk about. And then the last thing on the slide is we do have a podcast that I and my colleague Molly Keck do. It's called Bugs by the Yard. And it's about insects and whatever we kind of want to talk about. We tend to do 2 episodes per month, except for December when we only do 1 episode. But if you want to follow that podcast, you can stream it from your favorite streaming service that has podcasts. So if you have questions about this presentation, or if you want a copy of the PDF, you can shoot me an email and let me know, and I'm happy to send that out. So thank you so much, and I hope you enjoyed it.